Silas Blackwood returned to a house that had forgotten the sound of music. The silence in the grand wood-paneled Vermont estate was a physical entity, a cold, heavy blanket that had smothered all joy since his wife Alessa's death a year ago. He had come home early from a meeting in Boston, a rare and unsettling break in the relentless work schedule he used as an anesthetic. As he stepped into the marble foyer, shedding his rain-dampened coat, he heard it. It was a sound so foreign, so impossible, that for a moment he thought he was hallucinating. A ghost note played by his own grief-addled mind. It was the faint, melodic strain of a Chopin waltz, drifting from the one room in the house that had been sealed like a tomb, Alessa's music room. A cold, sharp anger, his most familiar companion these days, surged through him. He had given strict orders. No one was to enter that room. No one. He strode down the long, echoing hallway, his footsteps loud and purposeful. He threw open the heavy oak doors without ceremony, prepared to unleash his fury on whichever staff member had dared to defy him. But the scene that met his eyes was not one of defiance. It was one of quiet, impossible grace. The room was bathed in the soft grey light of the rainy afternoon, and in the center of the floor, Lena Petrova, the new cleaning woman, was dancing. She moved with a slow, fluid elegance, her bare feet whispering across the polished hardwood. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of serene concentration, lost in the music. But she was not dancing alone. Her hands, gentle but firm, were holding the limp, unresponsive hands of his 8-year-old son. Leo, the boy, sat in his wheelchair, his body as still and silent as it had been for a year, but his head, which usually lolled to one side in a state of vacant disconnection, was lifted. His eyes, the same startling blue as his mother's, were wide open, and they were following her. Silas froze, his hand still on the doorknob, the angry words dying in his throat. He watched as Lena spun slowly, a sad, beautiful pirouette, guiding Leo's chair with her. She was not just a woman cleaning a room, she was a partner in a silent, heartbreaking waltz. And his son, the boy who had not responded to a year of therapy, to a legion of specialists, to his own father's desperate pleas, was watching her. He was present. He was connected. For a single, shattering moment, the silence in his son had been broken, not by words, but by a dance. And Silas Blackwood, a man who had forgotten what a miracle felt like, was witnessing one. Before the silence, Silas Blackwood's life had been a symphony. He was a celebrated novelist, a modern Poe, whose thrillers were lauded for their intricate plots and dark psychological depth. His wife, Alessa, a concert pianist of breathtaking talent, was the vibrant, melodic counterpoint to his own brooding genius. Their life in the sprawling Vermont estate was one of art, music, and a profound intellectual partnership. Their son, Leo, was the crescendo, a bright, joyful boy who had inherited his mother's love for music and his father's contemplative eyes. Then came the accident, a single misstep on a rain-slicked balcony. That's what the police report said. Accidental, tragic, case closed. But for Silas, the case was never closed. It was a wound that refused to heal, and it festered with a poison he couldn't name guilt. They had been arguing just before she fell. A stupid, meaningless fight about his upcoming book tour. His last words to her had been sharp, impatient ones. He would never know if she had slipped, or if, in a moment of despair, she had let go. That guilt became the architect of his new life. He locked away Alessa's music room, a desperate, futile attempt to silence the ghosts. He cancelled the book tour. He stopped writing. The intricate, brilliant mind that had once woven complex narratives was now trapped in a single, repeating loop of what-ifs. And Leo was the living embodiment of his failure. The fall had been a double tragedy. Alessa was gone, and the son who had witnessed it was gone too, retreated into a silent, paralyzed world where no one could reach him. The doctors called it conversion disorder, a psychological trauma so profound it manifested as a physical paralysis, a traumatic mutism that locked him away inside his own small body. Silas, a man of words, was left with a son who had none. A man of action was left in a state of complete and utter powerlessness. He threw his fortune at the problem, hiring the best neurologists, therapists, and in-home nurses. They came with their charts and their gentle, patronizing tones, and they all left with the same grim prognosis: profound trauma, uncertain recovery. We must be patient. But Silas had no patience. He had only a gnawing, ever-present guilt. He believed, in the darkest corners of his heart, that Leo's silence was a punishment, a judgment on his own failings as a husband and a father. So he retreated, hiding in his study, losing himself in the amber depths of a whiskey glass. He managed his son's care like a business, reviewing reports, approving expenses. But he could not bring himself to simply sit with the boy. To look into his son's vacant eyes was to look into the abyss of his own regret. The grand, beautiful house, once a haven of creativity and love, had become a cold, silent prison, and he and his son were its solitary, haunted inmates. Lena Petrova was a ghost in a house already haunted. She moved through the grand, silent rooms with a quiet reverence, her cleaning cloth tracing patterns over surfaces that had forgotten the warmth of human touch. To the other staff, she was an enigma, a Russian immigrant with a past she never spoke of and a sadness in her eyes that mirrored the home's own pervasive grief. They knew her only as efficient, meticulous, and nearly invisible. They did not know she was a reader of sorrows, an expert in the silent language of pain. Her own past was a land of ghosts. She had once been a respected music therapist in a St. Petersburg children's hospital, known for her uncanny ability to reach children locked away by trauma. She used Chopin and Rachmaninoff as keys, unlocking doors that had been sealed for years, but that life had ended with the sudden, brutal death of her own young son from a virulent fever, a loss that had shattered her world and her faith in her own healing abilities. She had come to America to escape, taking this simple, anonymous job because she believed she was done with healing. She thought she had nothing left to give. But in this house, her old instincts stirred. She was a silent observer, and she saw what the trained nurses and the grieving father missed. She saw that Leo's stillness was not empty, it was a vigil. She saw how his tiny hand would clench into a fist, a barely perceptible knot of tension. Whenever his uncle, The charming and ever-present Gideon Finch entered the room with his smooth, solicitous voice. She saw how Leo's eyes, which followed nothing else, not a bird outside the window, not a brightly colored toy, would sometimes drift and fix upon the closed double doors of Alessa's music room. He would stare at them, his expression unchanging, but with an intensity that was almost a physical force, as if he could hear a melody that no one else could. And she noticed the rhythm of his breathing. It was often shallow and tight, but when a particular Vivaldi piece would play on the house's automated sound system, a piece she knew Alessa had loved, his breathing would deepen, his shoulders would relax, a microscopic, unconscious surrender to the memory of the music. These were not data points to be logged in a chart. They were clues, fragments of a story a little boy was screaming in complete and utter silence. In her small, sparse room in the staff quarters, Lena's one luxury was a small, battered MP3 player, loaded with the classical piano compositions she had once used in her therapy sessions. At night, she would listen, not for pleasure, but to keep the part of her that knew how to heal from atrophying completely. She had come to this house seeking silence, but in Leo Blackwood's profound, unreachable silence, she heard an echo of her own, and a part of her she thought was long dead began to stir, listening. The collision was precipitated by an act of quiet rebellion. Lena, driven by an instinct she could no longer ignore, had begun to leave the music room doors slightly ajar during her cleaning rounds. She told herself it was to air out the musty space, but in truth, it was an offering, a small, silent invitation for the music of the house to find its way back to its heart. Gideon Finch, on one of his frequent, unannounced visits, was the one who noticed. He walked past the music room and stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes narrowing at the sliver of light spilling into the hallway. He pushed the door open to find Lena inside, a feather duster in hand, gently tracing the outline of the grand piano. The piano, a magnificent Bosendorfer, had been kept covered by a heavy velvet cloth since Alessa's death, a shrouded monument in a sealed tomb. Lena had removed the cover. The polished ebony surface gleamed in the soft afternoon light, no longer an object of mourning, but an instrument, waiting. Gideon's reaction was not one of sadness, but of a sharp, proprietary anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, his voice a low, menacing hiss. "Who gave you permission to be in here, to touch this?" Lena straightened, her expression calm, though her heart began to beat a little faster. "I was just dusting. Mr. Finch, the room has been closed for a long time." "It is closed for a reason," he said, stepping into the room. He moved with a snake-like grace, his affable mask replaced by something cold and hard. "It is a place of grief, not a museum for the cleaning staff to wander through." He walked over and, with a sharp, angry flick of his wrist, threw the velvet cover back over the piano, once again plunging it into darkness. "You are here to clean floors and wash windows," he continued, turning his glare on her. "You are not here to stir up painful memories. Do you understand?" It was then that Silas, drawn by the sound of voices from a part of the house that was supposed to be silent, appeared in the doorway. He saw Gideon standing over Lena, his posture aggressive, and he saw the piano, once again shrouded. "What's going on?" Silas asked, his voice weary. "I found her in here," Gideon said, his tone shifting instantly to one of solicitous concern. "Uncovering things. I know she doesn't mean any harm, Silas, but it's not healthy. For you, or for the boy. This room, it needs to stay closed." The collision was not just between Gideon and Lena. It was a collision of two opposing approaches to grief. Gideon, the enforcer of silence and forgetting. Lena, the advocate for gentle remembrance. Silas, trapped in the middle, exhausted and overwhelmed, made the path of least resistance his own. He looked not at Lena, but at the covered piano, the symbol of a pain he still couldn't face. "He's right," Silas said, his voice a low murmur, a quiet abdication of his own authority. "Please, Lena, just leave it be. Keep the doors closed." It was a small, quiet act of cowardice, but its impact was devastating. He had sided with the darkness, with the silence. He had chosen the man who policed his grief over the woman who was trying, in her own quiet way, to let the light back in. Lena looked at him, a flicker of profound disappointment in her eyes. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving the three men, one dead, one grieving, and one, a predator in disguise, alone in the suffocating silence once more. Silas's capitulation was the spark that ignited Lena's quiet rebellion. She had seen the flicker of life in Leo's eyes, and she would not let Gideon Finch or Silas's own fear extinguish it. The next afternoon, she waited until Silas had retreated to his study and Gideon was nowhere in sight. The house was hers. She did not open the music room doors. Instead, she walked to her own small room in the staff quarters and retrieved her battered MP3 player and a small, portable Bluetooth speaker. It was a humble arsenal, but it was all she needed. She returned to the main living area, where Leo sat in his customary spot by the window, his gaze fixed on the grey, indifferent sky. She placed the small speaker on a bookshelf, a respectful distance away, not wanting to startle him. Then she scrolled through her music library, her finger hovering over a specific track. It was Chopin's Waltz in C-sharp minor, a piece Alessa had played often, a melody of such heartbreaking, melancholic beauty it felt like the house's own forgotten soul. She pressed play. The first, soft, tentative notes of the piano drifted into the room. Leo's head, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, turned slightly from the window toward the source of the sound. His eyes, once vacant, held a flicker of something distant and deep recognition. Lena's heart began to pound. She didn't speak. She didn't approach him. She simply began to move. In the center of the vast, empty room, she began to dance the waltz. It was a dance for an audience of one. Her movements were slow, graceful, a story told in the sweep of an arm, the turn of a head. She was not performing, she was communing with the music, with the memory of the woman who had once filled this house with it, and with the silent, watchful boy in the corner. And then she did something even bolder. She walked over to Leo's wheelchair. She knelt before him, her eyes on his. "May I?" she whispered, extending her hands. She did not wait for a verbal reply. She gently took his limp, unresponsive hands in hers, and she began to dance with him. She moved his arms in a slow, gentle approximation of the waltz, her own body swaying, turning, guiding his inert form in a partnership of quiet, desperate hope. She was no longer a cleaner, she was a therapist, a healer, a bridge to a world he had lost. It was at that moment that Silas, drawn from his study by the impossible sound of Chopin, walked into the room. He stopped dead in the doorway, his briefcase slipping from his nerveless fingers and landing on the floor with a soft thud. The scene before him was so surreal, so utterly impossible, that his logical, ordered mind refused to process it. The music, Alessa's music, filling the house for the first time in a year. The cleaning woman, dancing a waltz with his paralyzed, unreachable son. And Leo. Leo's eyes were not on the window. They were fixed on Lena's face, tracking her every movement, his expression one of rapt, absolute concentration. For a single shattering moment, his son was no longer a ghost. He was there. Silas did not feel anger. He did not feel outrage. He felt a profound, seismic shock, a crack in the very foundation of his grief, the logic of his despair, the certainty of his son's lostness. It all began to crumble in the face of this quiet, impossible dance. He began to question everything: the accident, the diagnosis, his own cowardly retreat from life. A single, terrifying, and exhilarating question began to form in his mind. What if he had been wrong about everything? At that moment, the novelist realized the most important story in his house was one he hadn't known was being written. If you believe that music has the power to heal what words cannot, give us a like to support Lena's journey, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The dance was a catalyst, a stone dropped into the still, stagnant pool of Silas's grief. The ripples it created disturbed the quiet despair he had mistaken for peace. He did not, as Gideon would have expected, fire Lena on the spot for her flagrant disobedience. He did something far more unnerving. He began to watch. His first act of investigation was not one of confrontation, but of surveillance. That evening, he retrieved a small, discreet security camera from a box of old home office equipment, a piece of technology he had once purchased to monitor a construction site, and placed it on a high bookshelf in the living room, its tiny lens aimed at the space where the waltz had occurred. He told himself it was a necessary precaution, a way to monitor Leo's well-being. But in truth, he was monitoring a miracle, desperate to understand its mechanics. He spent the next day in his study, not writing, but watching the live feed on his tablet. He saw Lena go about her duties with her usual quiet efficiency, but now he saw her through a new lens. He saw the way she would pause in her dusting to hum a soft Russian lullaby, and he saw the way Leo, from across the room, would tilt his head a minute, almost imperceptible shift, in her direction. He saw her bring in a small wooden music box, a simple, unadorned thing, and place it on the table beside Leo's chair. She opened it, and the tinkling, delicate melody of a Tchaikovsky piece filled the air. She didn't force Leo to look at it. She simply let it play, a quiet offering. And Silas, his eyes glued to the screen, saw his son's fingers, which had been curled into a tight, still fist, slowly, almost painfully, uncurl. This was not the work of a cleaner. This was the work of a healer. His investigation deepened. He bypassed his own HR department, knowing Gideon had eyes and ears there. Instead, he made a call to a private security firm he had used for corporate due diligence in the past. The request was simple and discreet. "I need a comprehensive background check on a Russian national named Lena Petrova. I want to know everything." While he waited, he began his own, more personal investigation. He forced himself to do what he had not done since Alessa's death. He walked into her music room. The air was thick with the scent of lemon oil and disuse. He ran his hand over the closed lid of the Bosendorfer, the polished wood cool beneath his touch. On the music stand, a single sheet of music remained. It was the Chopin Waltz. He looked at it, really looked at it. For the first time, it was covered in Alessa's familiar, elegant pencil markings, notes on phrasing, on tempo, and, in the top corner, a small, handwritten dedication. "For Leo. So he will always know the sound of my heart." The words were a dagger. This wasn't just a song she had been practicing. It was a gift she had intended for their son. A legacy, and he, in his grief, had locked it away, silencing her last message of love. He looked at the silent piano, and then at the live camera feed on his phone, where Lena was now quietly showing Leo a picture book, and he felt a profound, sickening sense of his own failure. He had been so focused on the final, ugly argument that he had forgotten the symphony of love that had preceded it. He was beginning to understand that in order to solve the mystery of his wife's death, he first had to solve the mystery of her life. The report from the security firm arrived in a sealed, encrypted file 2 days later. Silas opened it in the locked solitude of his study, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. The woman who had so profoundly entered his life was a complete and utter mystery, and he was not sure he was prepared for the truth of who she was. The file was not what he expected. There were no criminal records, no red flags. Instead, there was a story, a life of quiet, extraordinary resilience. Lena Petrova had been a rising star in the world of music therapy in St. Petersburg. The report contained translated articles from Russian pediatric journals, co-authored by her, detailing her innovative work using musical resonance to treat children with profound psychological trauma. There were photographs of her in a hospital setting, a guitar in her hands, surrounded by smiling, engaged children who, the captions noted, had been previously deemed unreachable. She had been a respected professional, a healer. Then, the narrative turned dark. The report detailed the death of her 5-year-old son, Dmitri, from a sudden, aggressive form of meningitis. It included a copy of the official hospital report and a brief, heartbreaking quote from a former colleague. She blamed herself. She was a healer who couldn't heal her own son. The grief destroyed her. After her son's death, she had resigned from the hospital, sold her apartment, and, according to immigration records, had arrived in the United States 6 months later on a simple work visa, leaving her old life, her career, her very identity, behind in the frozen soil of a Russian winter. Silas sat back. the words on the screen blurring. The quiet, unassuming woman who cleaned his house was not just an immigrant seeking a better life. She was a fellow survivor, a person who, like him, had had her world shattered by a sudden, senseless loss. Her silence was not a lack of sophistication. It was the heavy cloak of a grief as profound as his own. He had seen her as a simple cleaner, but she was his mirror. Later that day, he found her in the garden, pruning Alessa's now neglected rose bushes with a gentle, knowing hand. He didn't speak of the report. He didn't let on that he knew her secret. Instead, he asked a single, quiet question. "The music," he said, his voice stripped of all pretense. "How do you know which songs will work?" Lena paused in her work, her pruning shears held still in her gloved hand. She looked not at him, but at a single, perfect white rose that had managed to bloom amidst the thorns and weeds. "Trauma has a rhythm, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice a low murmur, a dissonant one. "It's all sharp edges and broken time signatures. The right music doesn't fight that rhythm. It meets it. It finds a harmony within the chaos." She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw not the maid, but the therapist. Her eyes were full of a deep, sorrowful wisdom. Children like Leo, they are not empty. They are full of a music that is too painful to play. They are not waiting for a cure. They are waiting for someone who is not afraid to listen to their silence. The hero's secret was not that she was a trained professional. It was that she understood, on a cellular level, the very nature of the pain that had imprisoned his family. She had walked through the same fire, and she knew the way out was not through fighting the flames, but by learning to sing in the dark. In that moment, she was no longer just an employee. She was his guide, a fellow traveler in the desolate landscape of loss. Lena's words, a harmony within the chaos, became the lens through which Silas began to re-examine the last day of Alessa's life. He had been so consumed by the guilt of their final angry argument that he had allowed it to become the only memory of that day. But now, guided by a new, painful clarity, he forced himself to look beyond the fight, to search for the notes that had come before the dissonance. He sat in Alessa's music room, the velvet cover removed from the piano for good, and began to piece together the timeline. Alessa had been practicing that morning. He remembered the sound of the Chopin waltz drifting through the house. She had been excited, energized. She was preparing for a small, private recital for a group of influential arts patrons, an event she hoped would secure major funding for a new youth orchestra program. The argument, he now recalled, hadn't been just about his book tour. It had been about Gideon. The trap, the buried truth, was not a single, shocking revelation, but a series of small, dissonant details that, when viewed together, formed a horrifying chord. He remembered Alessa, her face flushed with a rare, cold anger, holding a sheaf of financial statements. "He's doing it again. Silas," she had said, her voice tight. "Gideon, he's moving money. I found these statements in the study. He's funneling funds from your personal investment accounts into one of his shell corporations." Silas, preoccupied with his manuscript deadline, had been dismissive. "It's probably just a tax strategy." "Alessa, Gideon handles all of that. "You know I don't have the head for it. This isn't a strategy," she had insisted, her voice rising. "It's theft. He's been bleeding you dry for years, and you refuse to see it. I'm calling the lawyer. I'm showing him this. It ends today." That had been the real heart of their fight. His willful blindness versus her fierce, protective clarity. He had accused her of being dramatic, of interfering. She had accused him of being a coward, of letting his charming, manipulative cousin take advantage of his trust. And Gideon had arrived in the middle of their argument, walking in with his usual easy smile, a bottle of expensive wine in hand. He had heard it all. The timeline in Silas's mind began to solidify with a terrible, sickening logic. Alessa was going to expose him. She had the proof in her hands. She was going to cut him off from the endless supply of cash he had been secretly siphoning for years. Her recital that evening would have put her in a room with some of the most powerful people in the state, people who, if they knew, could ruin him with a single phone call. She was not just a threat to his lifestyle. She was a threat to his very survival. The accidental fall was no accident. It was the only possible outcome. It was the brutal, silencing answer to the threat she posed. Silas sat on the piano bench, the room spinning around him. The trap was not that his wife had died. The trap was that he had let it happen. He had been so lost in his own world, so content to let Gideon handle things, that he had ignored his wife's warnings. He had dismissed her fears. He had, in his own passive, negligent way, been an accomplice to her murder. The guilt he had been carrying was real, but it was for the wrong crime. It wasn't his angry words that had killed her. It was his silence. And in that moment, he knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the marble floor, that he would not be silent anymore. The fragile peace in the Blackwood estate, cultivated by Lena's quiet, patient work, was about to be shattered. Silas, now armed with a terrible and galvanizing certainty, began to move. His first call was not to the police, he knew. He still lacked the irrefutable proof to reopen a closed case, but to his corporate attorneys in Boston. He instructed them to begin a quiet, deep-dive forensic audit into every financial account managed by Gideon Finch. But Gideon was not just a thief. He was a survivor, a man with a finely tuned instinct for self-preservation. He felt the shift in Silas's demeanor almost immediately. The calls he made to the estate were now screened by a new, polite but firm assistant. The invitations to visit were met with vague, non-committal responses. Silas, the passive, grieving man he had so easily controlled, was no longer accessible. And Gideon knew, with a predator's certainty, that the quiet, foreign cleaning woman was the cause. He saw her not as a healer, but as an influencer, a usurper who was threatening his carefully constructed kingdom, and so he launched a vicious, preemptive counterattack, aimed at destroying her credibility and re-establishing his control over Silas. His first move was subtle. He began to plant seeds of doubt among the household staff. He would pull the head housekeeper aside, his voice a low, concerned murmur. "I'm worried about Silas," he'd say. "This new woman, the cleaner, she seems to have an almost unhealthy influence over him. He's making strange decisions. Have you noticed his next move was more direct?" He paid a visit to the small rural Vermont town's police chief, an old acquaintance. Over a friendly lunch, he painted a picture of a grieving, vulnerable man, his cousin, Silas, being taken advantage of. "She's an immigrant, no family, a mysterious past," Gideon said, shaking his head sadly. "I ran a background check myself unofficially, of course, and it's spotty. I'm just concerned she might be a grifter, preying on his emotional state." He wasn't filing a formal complaint, not yet. He was just expressing concern, a good citizen looking out for his family. But his most venomous attack was aimed at Silas himself. He waited until he knew Silas would be at his most vulnerable late on a Sunday evening, the anniversary of Alessa's birthday. He didn't call. He simply appeared at the front door, his face a mask of somber, brotherly love. He found Silas in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I know today is hard," Gideon said, his voice a soft, sympathetic balm. He let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "Silas, we need to talk about the woman, Lena. I know you think she's helping Leo, but people are starting to talk. They see a stranger, a foreigner, with complete access to your home, to your child. They're worried you're not thinking clearly." He leaned forward, his tone shifting to one of urgent, feigned protection. "She is a risk, Silas, to you and to Leo. What if she hurts him? What if she's after your money? You are a famous, wealthy man. You are a target. You need to let her go. For your own safety. For Alessa's memory." He was using Silas's deepest fears. His fear of being a bad father. His fear of being taken advantage of. His fear of dishonoring his wife's memory and turning them into weapons. He was attempting to isolate Silas once more, to sever the one connection that was leading him toward the truth, and to drag him back into the dark, silent world where he was so much easier to control. Dr. Eli Matthews was a man in his late 60s, a semi-retired child psychologist who had once been at the top of his field. He had been one of the first specialists Silas had hired after the accident, a man with a sterling reputation and a gentle grandfatherly demeanor. But their sessions had been a failure. Leo had remained unresponsive, and Silas, in his frustration, had dismissed Dr. Matthews, chalking him up as another expensive disappointment. Now, faced with Gideon's insidious campaign of doubt, Silas realized he needed more than his own conviction. He needed a credible, professional voice to validate what he was seeing, to counter the narrative of his own instability. In a moment of desperation, he found Dr. Matthews' old number and made the call. He didn't know if the man would even speak to him, but he had to try. To his surprise, Dr. Matthews agreed to a meeting immediately. He arrived at the estate the next afternoon, not with a clinical air, but with a quiet, scholarly curiosity. He listened without interruption as Silas, with a humility he had never shown before, explained everything. He spoke of his own blindness, of Lena's unconventional methods, of Leo's slow, miraculous reawakening, and of the terrible truth he had uncovered about Alessa's death. Dr. Matthews did not dismiss his story. Instead, he listened with a deep, focused attention, his fingers steepled under his chin. When Silas finished, the old doctor was silent for a long moment. "Mr. Blackwood," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "When I first treated Leo, I followed the established protocols for profound trauma. We focused on creating a sense of safety, on non-verbal therapies. But we failed. He looked at Silas, his eyes full of a humble, professional honesty. We failed because we were trying to treat the symptoms of his silence. This woman, Lena, she seems to have understood that his silence was not a symptom. It was a story, and she was trying to help him tell it. He asked to see Leo. The scene that unfolded was a quiet, powerful vindication. Lena was in the living room with Leo, a series of small, differently textured bells laid out on a blanket before him. She would ring one a high, clear, silver bell and wait. After a moment, Leo would slowly, deliberately reach out and touch the corresponding bell. It was a simple call and response game, but it was an act of profound, communicative will. Dr. Matthews watched, his eyes alight with a professional excitement Silas had not seen before. "This is extraordinary," he murmured. "She's not just engaging him, she's rebuilding his neural pathways through sound and touch. This isn't just playing. This is a sophisticated, intuitive form of non-verbal narrative therapy." In that moment, Dr. Matthews transformed from a memory of past failures into a powerful, unexpected ally. He was the credible, respected, and unimpeachable voice of science that could corroborate what Silas now knew to be true. He saw Lena not as an unqualified interloper, but as a gifted, intuitive practitioner. "Your brother-in-law is wrong," Dr. Matthews said to Silas later. After they had left Lena and Leo to their game, "You are not unstable. You are, for the first time, seeing your son clearly. And whatever you need from me to prove that, a formal assessment, a sworn affidavit, my testimony in court, you will have it." The threat from Child Protective Services, the whispers of his own instability, they no longer seemed so menacing. He now had an expert in his corner, a man of science who was willing to testify to the power of a miracle. With Dr. Matthews' support providing a crucial shield of credibility, Silas and Lena now had the space to focus on the one thing they still lacked, the final, irrefutable piece of evidence that would tie Gideon directly to Alessa's death. They had a motive, the embezzlement. They had a narrative, the children's testimony. But they needed a smoking gun, something that would stand up in a court of law and obliterate Gideon's carefully constructed alibi. The answer, Lena suspected, was not in financial records, but in music. A musician's soul is in their hands, in their muscle memory. She explained to Silas one evening, as they sat in the now open music room. Alessa was a world-class pianist. Her most important work, her deepest feelings, would be in her compositions, in her notes. Together, they began a meticulous, almost archaeological exploration of Alessa's musical life. They sorted through stacks of sheet music, listened to hours of her old practice recordings. It was a painful, intimate process for Silas. Each note a fresh memory, but Lena's steady, focused presence kept him grounded. They were looking for Alessa's final project, a collection of original compositions she had been working on in the months before her death. Gideon had dismissed it as a few unfinished sketches, but Alessa had been excited about it, calling it her most personal work yet. They couldn't find it. The manuscript was gone from the piano, the digital files wiped from her computer. It was as if it had never existed. He must have taken it, Silas said, a new cold fury rising in him. It must have contained something that incriminated him. Or, Lena countered, her therapist's mind seeing a different angle. He didn't take it because he didn't know where to look. Her eyes scanned the room, not at the obvious places, but at the hidden ones. She remembered a story Alessa had once told Silas, a story he had relayed to Lena, about a secret compartment in the Grand Bosendorfer piano, a place where the original builders would sometimes leave a signed note. It was a romantic, old-world detail that Alessa had loved. Silas, his heart pounding, knelt beside the piano. He ran his hand along the ornate, carved underside, searching for a seam, a hidden latch. His fingers found a small, almost invisible indentation. He pressed. A small, wood-paneled section of the piano's base clicked open, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. It was not empty. Inside was a single, leather-bound music journal, Alessa's. Silas's hands trembled as he lifted it out. He opened it, and on the first page, in her elegant, familiar script, were the words, "My Opus," for S and L, forever. But it wasn't just a music journal. Tucked between the pages of complex, beautiful compositions was a small, thin, digital voice recorder, with a sense of both dread and vindication. Silas pressed play. Alessa's voice filled the silent room, not singing, not playing, but speaking, her tone low and strained, a secret diary of sound. The recording was dated the morning of the day she died. Gideon was here again. Alessa's voice whispered from the small device. He knows I found the accounts. He didn't even try to deny it. He threatened me, Silas. He said if I went to you, if I exposed him, he would silence me for good. He said you were weak, that you would choose him over me. I'm scared. I don't know what he's capable of. I'm going to confront him one last time this afternoon. I'm recording this, just in case he's right. And you don't believe me. The recording ended. It was the final, devastating piece of evidence. It was Alessa's voice from beyond the grave, not just predicting her own murder, but naming her killer. It was a direct, irrefutable testament, hidden in the heart of her music, waiting for someone to finally, truly listen. The stage for the final act was set not with malice, but with a quiet, somber inevitability. Silas, now armed with Alessa's final, chilling testimony, did not need to lay a trap. He simply had to open the door and let the truth walk in. He called Gideon. His voice was a carefully controlled instrument, betraying none of the cold fury that raged within him. "Gideon," he said, "you were right. I haven't been thinking clearly. The stress, the grief, it's been too much. I need your help." He told him that he had decided to sell a significant portion of his publishing back catalogue, a move that would require Gideon's expertise to navigate the complex contracts. He asked Gideon to come to the estate the next afternoon to review the paperwork. It was a bait Gideon, blinded by his own arrogance and greed, could not resist. He saw it as his final victory, the moment Silas completely and utterly capitulated, handing over the keys to the kingdom. Gideon arrived the next day, his face a mask of practiced, sympathetic concern. He found Silas in his study, a stack of legal-looking documents on the desk before him. "I'm glad you came to your senses." "Silas," Gideon said, his voice a smooth, condescending purr. "It's for the best. You need to focus on healing, on Leo. Let me handle the burdens of the business." Silas simply nodded, his face unreadable. "There's just one thing I need to understand before we begin," he said, his voice quiet. He gestured to a small, ornate music box on the corner of his desk, a gift from Alessa years ago. "I found this. I can't seem to remember the melody it plays." He opened the box, but it was not the tinkling, mechanical sound of a music box that filled the room. It was Alessa's voice, clear and damning, emanating from the small digital recorder he had placed inside. Gideon was here again. "He knows I've found the accounts. He said if I exposed him, he would silence me for good." The color drained from Gideon's face. The mask of concern evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal panic of a cornered animal. He stared at the music box as if it were a snake, his mind scrambling, the wheels turning, searching for an escape that did not exist. "What? What is that?" he stammered, his voice a strangled whisper. "Some kind of deep fake, Silas. You're being manipulated. It's that woman, the Russian cleaner. She has nothing to do with this." "Gideon," Silas interrupted, his voice now as cold and hard as steel. He stood up, towering over his cousin for the first time. "This is about you, and Alessa, and the truth you thought you had buried." As Alessa's recorded voice continued to fill the silent room, the study doors opened. Two figures stood in the doorway. The first was Frank Miller, the private investigator. The second was a uniformed police detective. The curtain had not just been pulled back, it had been ripped from its moorings. Gideon Finch, a man who had orchestrated a perfect, silent crime, was undone by the one thing he had never counted on: the enduring, incorruptible power of his victim's voice. He looked from the music box to the detective, his entire world collapsing in a single, silent, terrifying moment. The performance was over. Gideon Finch, a man whose life had been a masterclass in manipulation, had no moves left to make. The recording was a checkmate. He stared at the detective, then at Silas, his mind a whirlwind of frantic, useless calculations. He opened his mouth, a desperate, sputtering denial forming on his lips, but the sound of Alessa's voice, still playing from the music box, choked the lie in his throat. The collapse was swift and absolute. There was no struggle, no dramatic confrontation. There was only the quiet, methodical process of justice finally being served. The detective stepped forward, his voice calm and professional. "Gideon Finch, you are under arrest for the murder of Silas Blackwood." The click of the handcuffs was a small, sharp sound in the quiet study, but it resonated with the finality of a slamming prison door. As he was led from the room, Gideon's eyes, full of a dawning, terrible understanding, met Silas's. It was a look stripped of all artifice, a raw, silent plea from a man who knew he was utterly, irrevocably damned. Silas did not feel triumph. He did not feel hatred. He felt only a profound, hollow emptiness, the quiet aftershock of a year-long earthquake. He had found the truth. But the truth had not set him free. It had simply confirmed that he was living in the wreckage of a life destroyed by a man he had once called family. The legal proceedings were a formality, a public epilogue to a story whose ending had already been written. Alessa's recording was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, complemented by the forensic audit of Gideon's finances and the quiet, powerful testimony of Dr. Matthews, who spoke to the profound trauma that had silenced Leo. The evidence was overwhelming. Gideon Finch was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The justice was absolute. But for Silas, it was a hollow victory. The real work, the work of healing, was just beginning. And that work started with Leo, with the monster gone. A palpable sense of safety began to settle over the house. The oppressive weight of Gideon's presence was lifted, and in its absence, Leo began to breathe. The progress was slow, measured not in days or weeks, but in small, miraculous moments. It started with a look. One afternoon, as Lena was playing a soft Debussy piece on the piano, Leo, who was sitting nearby, turned his head and met her eyes, holding her gaze for a full, uninterrupted 10 seconds. It was a look of pure, conscious connection, a sign that the boy who had been lost was beginning to find his way back. Then came a sound. Weeks later, as Silas was reading him a bedtime story, a familiar ritual that had always been a one-sided conversation, he paused, and into the silence, Leo whispered a single, raspy, almost inaudible word, "More." Silas froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He looked down at his son, whose eyes were fixed on the page, waiting. Tears streamed down Silas's face as he continued to read, his voice thick with an emotion too profound to name. The justice that mattered most was not the one that happened in a courtroom. It was here, in this quiet bedroom, in the sound of his son's voice, a ghost returning to the world of the living. The conviction of Gideon Finch was not an end, but a clearing. It was as if a long, suffocating storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world that was battered and scarred, but also washed clean, ready for new growth. The Blackwood estate, once a mausoleum of grief and secrets, slowly began to feel like a home again. The silence was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was peaceful, punctuated now by the tentative notes of Leo learning to speak again, and the ever-present, gentle melodies that flowed from Alessa's piano, now played daily by Lena. The most significant change was in Silas. With the crushing weight of his guilt and suspicion lifted, he was a man reborn. The brooding, reclusive novelist was replaced by a father, a present, engaged, and infinitely patient one. He found a quiet, profound joy in the small, everyday miracles of Leo's recovery. The first time the boy laughed out loud, the first time he used his hands to build a wobbly tower of blocks, the first time he asked a question. He knew that this new dawn would not have been possible without Lena. She was the quiet, steady light that had guided them out of the darkness. Her role in their lives had transcended any job title. She was not the cleaner, not the therapist, not even just a friend. She had become the heart of their reconstructed family. And Silas knew, with a clarity that came from his own painful journey, that her gift was too large to be contained within the walls of his home. He had seen firsthand how her unique, intuitive approach to healing had succeeded where traditional methods had failed. He had a new mission, a purpose that was bigger than writing the next bestseller. One crisp autumn evening, as the Vermont hills burned with the fiery colors of the changing leaves, he found Lena in the music room. She was sitting with Leo at the piano, guiding his small, hesitant fingers over the keys, teaching him a simple scale. The scene was one of such pure, uncomplicated peace that it brought a lump to Silas's throat. He waited until she was finished, and then he laid a proposal on the polished surface of the piano. It was the charter for a new organization, the Silas Blackwood Project for Music and Healing. Silas believed that music was a language that could speak directly to the soul. Silas said, his voice quiet but full of a new, passionate energy. She wanted to use her gift to help people, especially children who had been through trauma. He looked at Lena, his eyes full of a deep, humbling respect. "You have that same gift, Lena. You have a power to heal that is miraculous. I want to build a place where you can share that gift with the world. The foundation," he explained, "would be dedicated to providing music therapy, free of charge, to children and families affected by trauma. It would fund research, train therapists in Lena's intuitive, child-led methods, and create sensory-friendly musical spaces in hospitals and community centers. I can provide the resources," Silas concluded, his voice raw with sincerity. "I can build the infrastructure, but I cannot provide the vision. Only you can do that. I want you to be its founding director. I want you to take the miracle you performed in this house and offer it to every child who is lost in the silence." The new dawn was not just for the Blackwood family. It was for Lena. The woman who had fled her own country, her own grief, seeking anonymity, was now being offered a chance to reclaim her purpose on a scale she had never imagined. It was a chance to transform her own quiet, personal healing into a powerful, public legacy. The Silas Blackwood Project for Music and Healing opened its doors not in a gleaming, modern building, but in a beautifully restored old church in a quiet, accessible part of rural Vermont. The space was designed by Silas himself, a masterpiece of acoustics and light, with warm wooden floors, soft, sensory-friendly lighting, and rooms filled with instruments of every kind. It was a space built not for performance, but for peace. Lena, as the foundation's director, thrived. She assembled a team of therapists who shared her philosophy that healing was not a process of fixing, but of listening. She developed a curriculum that was less about musical theory and more about emotional expression. The foundation quickly became a beacon of hope, a place where children who had been silenced by the world could find their voices again, whether through the triumphant crash of a cymbal, the mournful cry of a cello, or the simple, steady rhythm of a drum. Silas found a new kind of fulfillment that his literary fame had never provided. He was not the distant benefactor. He was an active, engaged participant. He would spend his afternoons at the foundation, not in the boardroom, but in the music rooms, often just sitting quietly in a corner, watching as Lena worked her quiet magic. He saw in the faces of the children the same slow, miraculous reawakening he had witnessed in his own son. Leo, now a bright, talkative 10-year-old, was the foundation's heart. His physical paralysis was a permanent part of his life, but his spirit was unbound. He moved through the world in a state-of-the-art wheelchair, but his true mobility was in his music. He had become a gifted young cellist, his playing full of a depth and emotion that belied his years. He was a living, breathing testament to the Foundation's mission. The relationship between Silas and Lena settled into a deep, quiet partnership. It was a bond that defied easy labels. They were not lovers, but they were more than friends. They were co-creators, two survivors who had found a shared purpose in the wreckage of their pasts. They were a family, a unique and modern one, built not on romance, but on a foundation of profound, mutual respect and a shared love for the boy who was the center of their world. The legacy they were building was not one of wealth or fame, but of quiet, transformative healing. It was the legacy of Alessa, whose love of music had, in the end, become a force that healed the very wound her death had created. It was the legacy of Lena, a woman who had lost her own son but had found a way to become a mother to hundreds of others. And it was the legacy of Silas, a man who had lost his voice in grief but had found it again in the act of helping others find theirs. One evening during the Foundation's annual student recital, Silas sat in the audience, watching as Leo performed a solo cello piece. The music was a haunting, beautiful melody of his own composition. As the final resonant note faded into the hushed silence of the auditorium, Silas looked over at Lena, who was standing in the wings, her face illuminated by the stage lights, her eyes shining with tears of pure, unadulterated pride. In that quiet, shared glance, the entire story was told. It was a story that had begun in the darkest silence, but had ended here, in a room filled with the most beautiful music of all the sound of healing.